All right. So last class period, we started to talk about decolonization. And we talked about decolonization in South Asia. In South Asia, in India, decolonization happened peacefully through negotiation. There wasn't some sort of violent revolution or violent breaking apart that took place. Today, we need to look at some examples of regions that won their independence from European powers after World War II through an armed struggle. And we're going to start off by looking at Vietnam. Vietnam was a French colony. And general rule of thumb, but it's a good rule of thumb. Britain was willing to let their colonies go fairly peacefully through negotiations. France was more aggressive in trying to hold on to its remaining colonies in the world. We're not going to talk about the French in North Africa, but they try to hold on to North Africa after World War II, and eventually they lose it as a result of a successful rebellion against them. Well, today, though, we're going to talk about Vietnam. Vietnam is in Southeast Asia and had been a French colony for almost 200 years by the end of World War II. After World War II, France tries to hold on to their colony, and the Vietnamese achieve independence in an armed rebellion. The major leader in Vietnamese independence is an important 20th century figure named Ho Chi Minh. Now, we've looked at nationalists who are also liberals. Gandhi was a nationalist. He was also a liberal. I would argue Ataturk was a nationalist and a liberal. But we're also going to look at some nationalists who are not liberals, and Ho Chi Minh is one of them. Ho Chi Minh is a communist. So he wants to make an independent Vietnamese state from France, but he also wants this new state to be a communist state. After breaking away from French control, and it's a very long story that I'm not going to get into deeply, Vietnam, the region achieves independence, but it's divided between a communist North Vietnam and a Western-backed South Vietnam. So already there's lots of tension. In 1955, Minh and his forces attack South Vietnam and attempt to unite it into one country. So again, as a nationalist, he wants to join these two parts of Vietnam together. As a communist, he wants to make it a communist state, backed by the Soviets. So remember that decolonization is taking place at the same time as the Cold War. Well, you have a North Vietnamese communist state trying to spread communism to South Vietnam. That goes directly into the face of American political policy during the Cold War. And as part of our containment policy, the United States is going to send troops to try to keep South Vietnam non-communist. You'll notice I'm being very delicate with the words I say. I didn't say to keep South Vietnam democratic. They were not really democratic, but they certainly weren't communist. The Vietnam War eventually becomes a Cold War proxy war when the United States sends troops in 1963 to South Vietnam. And from like 65 to 71, it really escalates. And it's basically the United States, some of our NATO allies, and the South Vietnamese fighting against the North Vietnamese, who were backed by the Soviets, and to a lesser extent, the Chinese. This was a very controversial war for the United States, and the longer the war was fought, the heavier the casualty count was, the less and less support Americans had for the war. In 1973, the United States reaches an agreement with the Vietnamese leadership. By this time, Ho Chi Minh has died. We reached an agreement with the North Vietnamese leadership and we withdraw troops. Well, it's not long after we withdraw our troops that North Vietnam restarts the war, and this time the United States does not send troops, and North Vietnam captures the capital, South Vietnam, Saigon, and North and South Vietnam are united into one state. So the ultimate goals and dream of Ho Chi Minh was reached, which was he wanted to create an independent Vietnamese nation state that was communist. This is the only war the United States has ever lost, and in many ways, this is the biggest failure of the United States attempt at containment during the Cold War. And this was probably also either the lowest point or the closest to the lowest point for the United States during the entire Cold War era. Let's talk about decolonization in Africa. We're going to talk about Ghana. Before 1957, Ghana was a British colony, and it was a British colony called the Gold Coast. That should tell you a lot about what the British were interested in. This was the region once upon a time that had been part of Mali's empire way all the way back in period one. And this was a region that did have gold in some abundance. In 1957, there's a negotiated peaceful withdrawal by the British. Again, general rule of thumb, the British are going to give up their colonies peacefully after World War II. The nationalist leader who is going to lead Ghana to independence after the British withdrawal is a very unique figure named Kwame Nkrumah. Now, Kwame, one of the interesting things about Kwame is he actually spent time in the United States. He spent time in London. He lived in Harlem for several years. But ultimately, he becomes a socialist. So he is a nationalist in that he wanted to create an independent Ghanaian state, but he's also a socialist. So I wouldn't really describe him as a liberal. The longer Nkrumah is in power, the more he leads his state in a direction of being backed by the Soviets. Also, the longer that Nkrumah is in power, the more power he seizes and the less democratic the state becomes. Originally, it was supposed to be a constitutional democracy, and increasingly, Nkrumah is seizing more and more power for himself. So he was a controversial figure in the United States. He was also a controversial figure within Ghana itself. He's also the leader of something called Pan-Africanism, which is this movement that sought to unite all Africans, even if you're not in Africa, people of African descent, into this idea that we're one people and we have one set of goals that we should be attempting to reach. Some people consider him one of the earliest founders of Pan-Africanism, but that's not really something we're jumping into in this class. In 1966, he went on a visit of state to Moscow. While he's in Moscow, opposition forces seize power in a coup. It's possible, by possible I mean probable, that the CIA was backing the coup, and this was part of an American-backed attempt to overthrow a leader who is becoming increasingly socialist in a region of the world that we did not have many allies. And ultimately, Ghana will have more democratic institutions than it had under Nkrumah. And Nkrumah is a very controversial figure in African history, both as the good, hey, he led to a negotiated independence, but also as someone who increasingly was becoming Marxist. Now, as we know, all of Africa was a British and French colony at one point during the 20th century, or a European colony, I should say. After World War II, you're eventually going to see a political map of Africa that looks like what you see on the right. All of these places are going to win their independence either through armed struggle or negotiated independence. However, Africa is going to have an enormous problem after World War II. And it's a problem that they're still dealing with, and it's a problem that Europe leaving, it's left behind issues that the African people as a whole are really still struggling with even to this day. And the problem is this: Africa is an incredibly linguistically, ethnically diverse place. On the left, you'll see a map of all the different ethnic groups and where they live in Africa. In the right, you see these new political states. And one of the things that is an issue in Africa is in each of these countries, you have lots of different ethnic groups with linguistic differences and who identify themselves as being very, very different groups of people with very, very, very different cultures. Many times when Europeans, and it was oftentimes the Europeans, made the maps of these new countries that they were creating when they withdrew, they're creating maps that don't really have a chance to be successful. Oftentimes they'll put two or more groups of people in the same state that for hundreds of years had been enemy warring tribes, sometimes even like different tribes that had sold each other into slavery in the previous units. So you've got you have ethnic tensions, you have linguistic tensions. In some places you have religious tensions where one group will be Muslim, another group will be Christian. And these states aren't really designed for long-term stability. The other problem with Africa is that when European powers leave, they leave behind very few infrastructure advances. Remember, Europeans did not come into Africa to build stuff and to create stuff. They don't build factories. They don't build power grids. They don't build up infrastructure. Europeans were in Africa to take things, to take natural resources. So even though by 1975, we're 225 years into the Industrial Revolution, there's very few industrial facilities. All these new states historically have been single export economies that don't have advanced economic systems. You have, again, these linguistic and ethnic differences within these new states. And oftentimes these new states have a very, very real problem achieving political stability. Unfortunately, the story of Africa after decolonization has largely been one of unstable political systems, ethnic warfare, poverty, and disease. Africa has a poverty problem. And until they can achieve economic stability, and I will say that in the last 20 years, many of these states have made great strides. It's not as bad as it was in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. But it's still not where African nationalists, even if they want to see Africa become. Some of the worst famines of the 20th century have taken place in Africa. One of the worst disease outbreaks, the HIV epidemic, is even to this day ravaging parts of Africa. So the story of decolonization in Africa, it still hasn't been rosy. And again, a lot of that has to do with the policies that Europeans had. They didn't build up infrastructure. They create new states with maps that puts groups of people who don't want to be in the same state in one state, or divides one people into multiple states who want to be inside one United State for themselves. And these are the sorts of issues that African leaders going forward are continuing to have to deal with. So we talked about South Asian decolonization. We talked about Southeast decolonization. We talked about decolonization in Africa. Let's talk about decolonization in the Middle East. If you'll remember, in the Middle East, after World War II, much of the territory that was in the Middle East became a mandate of Britain or France. These territories in yellow and green and blue had all been controlled by British and the French after World War I and II. Now, this right here, Morocco and Algeria, is the territory France loses to an armed revolution against them. We talked about that earlier today. So they won their independence through force of arms. Libya had been an Italian colony that they'd taken right before World War II. That gets released. What we're really interested in are these territories. After World War II, the British and the French are going to withdraw from the Middle East. Again, largely peacefully. And you're going to see new nation states created: Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, for example. Now, if you know anything about Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, political stability has been a challenge. So yes, this part of the story is very similar to the story that you see in Africa. Europeans were interested in these regions for raw resources: cotton in Egypt, oil in Iraq. They don't build up infrastructure. So many of the same economic challenges that you see in Africa, this region is going to have to endure. But they are going to achieve relative economic stability long term because of their oil reserves they control. They have access to one of the most valuable commodities in the 20th century. And this is going to cause earlier and quicker economic stability in these regions than you'll see in other places. The most controversial thing the British do after World War II is they create a Jewish homeland out of a territory right here called Palestine. Jews all over the world had, for many, many, many years, dreamed of one day having their own state. The British, after World War I, had basically promised this region to two different groups of people. They promised it to Arab nationalists who would help them fight in World War I, and they also promised it to Jewish nationalists as a homeland. They promised it to two different groups of people. After World War II ended, there was enormous international support for the idea of creating a Jewish homeland after the Holocaust and trying to ensure that something like that could never happen again. Now, I understand that. This is what the Jews traditionally consider their homeland. They've just gone through the hell of the Holocaust. I understand that belief system. However, Arab nationalists have something they would like to point out. Arabs had lived in this territory as the dominant group for 1,200 years. Arabs in World War I had fought and bled and died for this land, and they had been promised it. And Arabs in this region also pointed out, hey, listen, we're Muslims. We don't historically have things against the Jews. You should absolutely create a Jewish homeland. But why don't you create a Jewish homeland from the territory of Germany? Why don't you create a Jewish homeland from land taken from the country that just killed 6 to 9 million of them? And I think that's a very reasonable point. I think both sides have reasonable points to make here. And the real problem is that the British lied. They promised it to two different groups of people, which meant one group of people was going to feel very angry about this. And you make it even worse because Israel is holy land to two different religions. It's holy to Jews, it's holy to Muslims. So you add that element to the nationalist issues that are taking place as well, and it becomes a very complicated thing. After promising Palestine to both Jews and Arabs, after World War II, this land is given to the Jews, and Jews from all over the world migrate to this new Jewish state. So let's talk about this new state. Immediately upon its creation, the Arab states around it, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, become enemies, and these Arab states will attack Israel several times. There will be a whole series of wars fought between these states. There's one fought in 1948. There's one fought in 1956. There's a famous one called the 7 Days War. No, the 6 Days War. Excuse me, fought in 1967. And then there's a war called the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where all these Arab states around Israel joined together and attacked Israel on their holiest holiday when they knew their army would be standing down. What happens? What's the story of all these wars? Fundamentally, the story is every time they're attacked, Israel kicks their butts. Now, you might look at this map and you go, wait a minute, this country is so much smaller than all these other states around it. It has a lot smaller population than all these states around it. How are they possibly able to defend themselves time and time and time again from Arab attacks? And the answer is Israel has an ally. Israel is a liberal democracy, which means here comes the United States. And the United States have been propping Israel up militarily and economically because this is a region where the United States did not have many political allies during the Cold War near important oil regions. And increasingly during the Cold War, these Arab states were relying on Soviet support, especially Syria. So this also becomes a Cold War proxy battlefield. Jews from all over the world are going to migrate here. Eventually, Israel successfully detonates a nuclear bomb, and they are a nuclear power. But one of the major issues is as more and more Jews come to Israel, Palestinians, many of whom are Muslim and many of whom are Christians who had lived in these territories for, again, 1,200 years by now, some cases even longer than that, they get pushed off their homelands by this new Jewish majority living here. So you have ethnic tensions, you have religious tensions, you'll have dual nationalist movements. And because of this, Israel is going to become a target of Muslim extremism, terrorism. During the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, there was an organization called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, whose goal it was to annihilate this state, and they used terror as a way to do it. In the late 80s and 90s, it seemed like every day in Israel there was a terrorist attack. I will never forget this story. It was the early 1990s, and I was watching the news, and a little girl, and I think it was Tel Aviv, it was one of the cities in Israel. She was having her bat mitzvah, which I think is when a Jewish girl turns 13. It might be 12, not important to our story. It was a big birthday. Her parents had rented out a big party room for her to have this party in. There were hundreds of teenage kids and their families at this party, and a member of the PLO found out that this was happening, and he rented a truck, and he filled the truck with homemade bombs and thumbtacks, and he drove the truck right into the middle of the party. And it's one of the most scarring memories I've ever had in my life of some of the things I saw in that news report and those corpses that were being pulled out, and how they were, this poor people had just been sliced to bits at what was the happy occasion. Israel becomes a center for Islamic extremism. And I want to be careful. I don't want to portray Israel as innocent in this. They have had a very, very, very heavy hand with non-Jews, and they've definitely been censored by the United Nations for their actions. But this is going to cause all sorts of Muslim extremism, who especially want to regain this territory because Israel's holy ground, the city of Jerusalem, is holy to Muslims. It'll also become a target for Al Qaeda, which is the same terrorist organization that's ultimately going to be responsible for the 9/11 attack. And it's really important before we start to talk about that story in the days to come that you realize this. Israel could not have existed for 74 years at this point without American backing and American aid. One of the things that has happened since the Cold War ended is Israel has made peace with some of their Arab neighbors. Famously, they actually made peace with Egypt before the Cold War ended in the late 1970s. They make their peace with Jordan. Syria is a whole other story, and we're going to look at that when we talk about the war on terror and Al Qaeda a couple class periods from now. But the big takeaway is lots of regions decolonize, but that doesn't mean that they achieve the utopian society that leaders in those states had hoped for once they achieve independence. And there's very complicated and difficult issues that nationalists in each of these regions are going to have to deal with. Remember, decolonization is taking place during the Cold War. That's why the big theme of this unit is the Cold War and decolonization. You can't really separate one from the other. Hope you guys found this interesting. I will assign everyone their work. Y'all have a great day.